On a drizzling Monday afternoon in April, I lay in bed, a cold, wet cloth pressed to my forehead, and a waste paper bin overflowing with tissues beside me, as I listened to the droplets of rain clink against my bedroom window. What had begun as sunshine a moment ago had quickly turned to rain, pattering on the rooftop above like television static. A cool breeze blew in through a crack in my window, blowing in the smell of wet cement, noticeable only when I breathed in deeply through my stuffed-up nose. My bedroom was one of 4 in a dumpy old brick house on Bellevue Street. The wooden floorboards creaked when you walked on them, and the plaster in the walls was beginning to crumble, revealing in places the brick wall underlayer beneath. A small iron radiator purred gently in the corner, slowly losing its fight with the growing coldness of the outside. I coughed violently, the force tearing at my throat. I took a lozenge and a sip of water and drew my blanket close. Beneath the warm buzz of the heater, I could hear one of the other tenants talking downstairs. The man spoke gruffly, and his footsteps clopped as he paced around the room. His guest hardly spoke, and I might have thought the man was talking to himself, if it weren't for the odd, soft response I would catch from time to time. I had lived at Bellevue Place a little over a year now, and knew everyone in the house but the man downstairs. He kept to himself, coming and going at all hours in the night. I didn't know his name or what he did. The few times I had seen him, he hadn't smiled to me or said a word, and from what I'd heard from the others, he had been much the same with them. A part of me didn't mind listening into this conversation, if only to get a glimpse into this life that I knew so little about. The more I listened, the more I sensed an unpleasantness in the man's tone. Though the sounds were just muffles through the floorboards, I could still hear the deliberate way in which he spoke, as though it took him great effort just to speak at a normal volume. His guest took longer and longer in responding with anything at all, the silence between them at times stretching into the uncomfortable. Cutlery and dishes rattled in the kitchen below as thunder bellowed on the outskirts of town, and downstairs, I could hear the voices getting louder. The 2 men were really getting into it now. Or was one pleading? I wondered. Now that I listened, I did notice a whining in the guest's voice, a pitifully high-pitched noise that made me want to wince. I wondered if I should really be listening in, and I reconsidered just how much about this man I really needed to know. The tenant's voice grew only louder, roaring above the storm. I could feel the anger through my mattress and tried my best not to listen. As soon as I was better, I would have a word with the landlord. Even if this man thought he was alone, this was still no way to treat a guest who could in no way be deserving of such a tirade. I could hear the guest's sobs and only imagine what an ordeal this was for him. And still the shouts and the pleas persisted, clambering to a fever pitch with the growing madness of the storm outside. Thunder shook the house as a sound like a cannon erupted from the night. And as the last of the rumbles faded, I heard a second bang shortly follow. I was upright in a second. The sound was gone as quickly, and in the aftermath, the house had become eerily quiet. The argument downstairs had suddenly resolved itself, as if in the time it took for the house to settle. I sat as still as I could, straining my ears to hear for the slightest of noise in the silence downstairs. But the rainfall was too loud for me to pick out anything. As quietly as I could, I lowered my torso to the floor and pressed my ear into the carpet. I could just hear a creak, as though someone were walking around softly. There was a click, and a muffled ring, and suddenly I could hear the tenant's voice, oddly now much calmer. He said only a sentence or two to a person on the other end before there was a beep and the crunch of the phone being returned to its stand. And from then on it was just silence once more. I could feel my heart inside my chest. My shirt was damp with sweat. But I knew what I'd heard, and I needed to hear more. I didn't dare make a move for the phone at my desk and risk making a sound on the rickety floorboards. Rather, I would pay as much attention as I could to what was to follow, so I could give as detailed an account as I could for when I next got the chance to share. If I were to bring this to the police, I didn't want to act too hastily and risk not giving them enough to go on. For the next 20 or so minutes, there was little but the odd creak. I became aware of the smell of a cigar and wondered if the man wasn't waiting as much as I was. At last, I got my answer as there came a knock at the door. The chair squeaked as the man got up, his footsteps moving towards the front of the house before returning a moment later. A second set of footsteps with him now, as he spoke in a measured tone with someone else in the room. I could make out the word
Jesus
from a voice I didn't recognize. A short conversation followed, and though I couldn't make out a word of it, I strained my ears to the edge of their ability to try to catch even a passing phrase. But the words of the men were always frustratingly out of reach. I listened for any sounds that might give away what they were doing. And sure enough, as I listened, there came a rustling from down below, as though someone were moving the sheets of their bed. With it came grunts as well, as though whatever they were doing were causing the two men to strain themselves. Someone spoke, and a set of footsteps retreated to the front entry. There was the distant thud of a car door, before the man returned to a chorus of crinkling paper. For the next hour, a horrible scraping sound escaped the room, like the sawing of a shop broom. My stomach churned at the noise. My arms by now were beginning to hurt from holding my neck upright, and I felt lightheaded from being upside down for so long. But I couldn't bring myself to even adjust my position, for fear that the men could hear the squeaking of my mattress as well as I could hear the noises downstairs. There were sounds of cracks and of zipping, occasionally a pop or the dripping of something wet. At times, I could catch something slap stickily against the paper. And all the while I became more and more convinced that what I was listening to was the sound of a murder being attended to by men who were more skilled in the act than I would have otherwise liked to admit. My arm trembled. I winced as my wrists were beginning to hurt, and my palms had become sore from the carpet fibers pressing into them. I tried to readjust my arms so that I was resting on my forearms, but as it did, I heard the floorboard beneath me creak. Suddenly, the sawing down below ceased. I held my breath. The men were now whispering. Thunder crashed overhead, and in the dying rumbles I became aware of a thudding from outside my wall, and with a sickening twist in my gut, I realized that it was the sound of someone storming up the stairs. With a jolt, I leapt from my bed. The footsteps on the stairs doubled their pace, and I sprung for the door and flipped the two locks shut just as the thudding of their boots reached the second-floor landing. The door shuddered in its frame.
"Are you in there?"
the man shouted. I tried not to make a sound as my breaths came out in ragged whimpers. The wind outside shrieked like the angry wails of a banshee.
"Hey! Did you hear me?"
I could feel the handle try to turn. There came a flash of light, and another crash of thunder shook the house, and for a brief moment I could see my room in all its detail, as normal as it had ever looked before it faded as quickly into the night.
"I asked if you're in there, you little worm!"
The man's voice screamed inside my head. Just keep quiet, I kept telling myself. Don't make a sound. Perhaps they hadn't heard me lock the door over the noise they'd made thundering up the hall. The rain was like machine gun fire now. It was entirely possible, but then I heard the other man say,
We could always break it down.
I inched away from the door in time to see it shudder in place. I nearly let out a cry. A second followed and I saw a crack splinter across the wood. Without thinking, I felt for a lighter in my jacket that hung from its hanger as the third sent splinters flying across the room. I reached for the tissues by my bed, and as the door rattled again, this time the deadbolt plate loosening from its screws, I lit the clump of tissues and held them up to my smoke detector. Yellow flames sputtered from my hand, It took a second for the alarm to trip, but when it did, I heard it be accompanied by the others in the house as a light flashed from the device. Just like that, the door was still once more. I couldn't hear for the siren whether they'd truly gone. But all the same, I took the phone from my desk and fell to the floor, sitting in the roar of the alarms as I waited for someone on the other side to pick up. The winds died down by the time the call wrapped up. Over, as quickly as it had started. When the police arrived, we found a pile of bloody, scrunched up newspapers in the trash, but the body was nowhere to be discovered. To this day, we never heard of what happened to the tenant or who his guest had been that night. None of the other tenants were in the house at the time or knew a thing about it when I saw them again. All anyone had to talk about was how violent the storm from that day had been, and how it had came and went so unexpectedly.